and geology at the Masters University. He's got his degrees in Cedarville University, his PhD in Loma Linda University. He's been on archaeological digs. He's written articles. Let me put it, Matt knows his stuff. That's another way of saying that. And Matt, we know him as a dear friend. His wife, Jessica, their kids, Alaric, Cody, Iris, and Soren are there with us. But guys, the reason why Matt is here, this is really the reason why, is because he loves the Lord. And he faithfully handles the Word of God. And he does know science, and he does not have contradictions between the two. But the Scripture is the authority. The Lord is the authority. And that's what he's going to show us throughout today. So show lots of love and care and welcoming to Matt and his family. Matt, would you come on up?
Thank you, Travis. I'm just going to get stuff set up here, but good morning, everybody. Good morning. I know that it may still feel early for some of you, I understand. Not sure how everyone did with their night's sleep. That's always an unknown, right? And so, listen, if you do fall asleep, I will not be offended. If everyone is asleep, it's a little different, because then I don't have anybody to talk to. But no, I happy to be here. As Travis told you, I am a professor at the Masters University, and I also get to serve as the youth pastor at my church, Santa Clarita Baptist Church, and that's where Travis and Chelsea were when they were living in Santa Clarita while he was going to seminary. And we're happy to come up here and visit, and we got to see a good amount of Weaverville yesterday. Took us 10 minutes or so, but no, we got to walk all around. We went in different stores and things. It was really nice. My family's they live in the Adirondacks in upstate New York, so it's very, very similar. Like these little towns that, tourist season, like you double or triple in population, and then it disappears. So no, we really enjoyed it. We liked going around and seeing things. And I am a vertebrate paleontologist. So what that means is that I get to study fossils. And so there are some fossils out there that were brought in that are really cool. I think they're local, I'm guessing, but they are, there's some ammonites and things. Those are invertebrates, so they don't have any bones. Still very cool, but it's not typically what I work on. I usually work on things that have bones. And so I did bring for you, you guys can come and see this later. I was like, how often do you get to see and hold a real dinosaur bone, right? So I was like, okay, well, I got to bring that. So, when we're in between sessions or something, you can come and look at this, but this is a dinosaur bone right here. So this is part of a metacarpal, so a hand bone, of an Edmontosaurus. It's a big duck-billed dinosaur, so it's an animal that could be 30, 40 feet long. And this is, one of these bones in your hand, and it's about a third of it. So it should be like that long. And so you can imagine from that how big of an animal we're talking about. But when we get to do science and look at science, there's a lot of really exciting things. And understandably, our world is very interested in science. Am I moving here? There we go. Okay, so people talk about how much things have changed in just decades, right? With scientific advancement. I mean, we had people on the moon. We had just recently another mission go near the moon. They're planning on sending more back. That's incredible, right? And that is a scientific achievement. That was people. And remember, the first rockets they were sending up there, I mean, the computers on those rockets were about as sophisticated as a calculator, right? A four-function calculator. So incredible that we're able to figure all that out. That's very, very cool. And, of course, science is really, really important when we talk about medical advancements as well, right? There have just been enormous breakthroughs that conditions that have plagued humanity for thousands of years, right, have been treated. And yes, there's still things we don't know, right? Everybody knows that, and that's why we do research, but there's really cool medical breakthroughs happening all the time. You talk about a CT scan, right, that you can actually see inside of somebody while they're alive. You don't have to cut them open, right? That's a very cool thing, okay? Like, I'm very thankful for that. But with all of this, there also comes some perspectives, okay? So what I've got here, this is a book cover. This is a book that came out, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago. It's called Faith versus Fact, Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible. Okay, so this was written by a guy named Jerry Coyne. Jerry Coyne is an evolutionary biologist. If you've ever heard of Richard Dawkins, okay, who's very big in kind of the new atheism and everything, Dawkins, if you look at the back of this book, it's got a quote from him. This is a great book, right? So you get the feel of like where this book is going. And the idea with this is, Jerry Coyne is saying, it's impossible to be a person of faith while simultaneously being a person of science, right? He's saying you can't actually study the world around you, really, really learn it, and still hold on to these archaic notions of there being a God who gave us special revelation and stuff like that. And so, you know, our question needs to be, right, how should a Christian respond to this kind of thing? Has science disproven the Bible or the existence of God? Are faith and fact incompatible? Well, obviously, I think all of us are going to say no to those questions, right? We do think there's a God. We do think the Bible is true. We do think that faith and fact can work together. But the question is, if they can work together, how do they work together? Right? What does that actually look like? Okay? So to begin with, we actually have to ask a question. We need to ask, what is science? Okay, because we throw these words around, right, but we don't actually stop and think about, okay, what really are these words? Okay, and there's a ton of different definitions you could use here. I could ask for a poll from the audience. We could do all kinds of fun stuff. But I'm going to give you my working definition here, okay? And I'm going to say science is a process of getting a constantly closer approximation of physical reality. And you know that I'm a college professor, so I got to have these long definitions, right? But there's a reason I made this long. It wasn't to just be wordy. It's because we got to be very precise when we talk about this. So I say their science is a process. We're growing and changing in our knowledge all the time, right? The science of the 1940s is not the same as the science of the 2020s. It changes, okay? And the hope is with science that you're getting constantly closer to actually understanding what's out there, okay? When we first, you know, when Europeans first arrived in the Americas and they're like, what are these? There's like possums and sloths, like what are these things, right? They were very shocked to find these weird animals. And so they had tried to figure out, well, what are they? How are they related to things? So at one point, you know, they had no idea that sloths existed, right? And then they gained that information, and then they could start learning about it. And so that's how science works. And the thing is, there's two really important qualifications here, okay, for us to be able to move forward. The first one is this. It's an approximation. In science, we are constantly getting better. We're learning more. But can we ever be certain we know everything? And I think ultimately we're not ever going to know anything before Christ returns, right? We're fallible humans, okay? But if you don't know how much there is to know, it's very hard to be confident about what you should be confident about, right? And that's kind of where you're stuck in science, where it's like, well, we know enough to say this works, I can build a car and it seems to run and everything, but do I really understand what's going on the atomic level or the molecular level or whatever, right? There's a lot to learn there. And so that's one aspect of it. But the other one that's really important for us today concerns why I said physical reality. Science can only work on the physical because the tools it uses are physical tools, okay? So science cannot evaluate whether or not God exists. Science can't tell us whether fairies exist, or angels, or leprechauns, or ghosts. Science can't tell us whether the soul exists, okay? Because if those things are immaterial, if they don't actually have physical matter, then the problem is you can't test it. You can't put God in a test tube, okay? And so when people will say stuff like, well, science led me to conclude God doesn't exist, no, it didn't. It can't do that, okay? That's some kind of preconceived notion you have about the world that got you there, okay? So what science does is it's really good at what it does, but when you try and use it for other things, that's when you get yourself in trouble, right? Like, you know, screwdrivers are meant for screwing things in. Yes, you can hammer with them, right? Maybe in a desperate situation you have done this, okay? It's not the best tool for that job, right? But then there's other jobs that screwdrivers are completely inappropriate for, right? You can't, and we could go on, right? They're not scissors, they're not paper, you can't write on them. So like, you need to use the right tool, and science is a tool for the physical, okay? And so something really important to understand is that when we talk about scientific truth, it's not the same as when we say biblical truth. Okay, so I know some people like to say biblical truth is capital T, scientific truth is lowercase t. And what they mean by that is, you know, a truth in science go, you know, forward in history a few decades or hundreds of years, and it might not be true anymore, right? So if we were growing up in ancient Athens and we were going to school and they were teaching us about astronomy, because that was a big deal, and they would talk about that, they would tell you, oh yeah, everything moves around us and we're stationary. And that was just taught as fact. And it wasn't inappropriate for them to teach it as fact, because what they had available to them, that made the most sense, right? And now that we've learned a ton more things, we realize, oh no, it makes more sense to understand us as the one moving, and that kind of changes your perception. And so both times it was taught as fact, as truth, right? But it changed. And that's how science works. And it's good. That's what that animal does, right? Is that science is a continually changing thing. Theology is not like that. The Bible isn't like that. It's not like in 20 years you're going to come in here, hopefully, Lord willing, that you're going to come in here and they're going to say, oh, you know what? Actually, we were wrong about Jesus being God. Totally misunderstood that. We got new data. He's not, right? That's not going to happen. That's what God has revealed in here is what we have, okay? It's truth. Now, we can misunderstand that truth, but if we're understanding it accurately, it's not going to update. It's not going to change, okay? We don't have prophets giving us alterations to what's there. So, really important distinction between these things to get. And when you're doing science, okay, what you need to think about are these things called paradigms and worldviews. So, people love to say stuff like, oh, the evidence led me to this conclusion, okay? But that's not really accurate, okay? Because you always have to interpret evidence. That's how it works. Every time you look at evidence, you interpret it, and you interpret it through your paradigm. That's your way of thinking about things, right? So people that were looking at the night sky, you know, they saw the same stars, they tracked the same planets, they had the same measurements, and yet some of them said, oh, it's the stars that are moving, and someone said, no, it's us that's moving. They were using the same data, they were just interpreting it differently, okay? And it's very similar to how you think about a courtroom, right? Which, you know, hopefully you haven't had to be in a courtroom for bad purposes, okay? But you've seen courtroom dramas and things on TV, you understand how it works, right? That there's the defense and there is the prosecution, right? And so the prosecution comes up and they say, hey, this knife, you know, exhibit A, this is the murder weapon, right? It was found in the victim's back and it's got that guy's fingerprints on it. And if you're in the jury, you're like, okay, that's it, right? What other explanation could there be? Well, then the defense gets up and the defense says, well, yes, I agree that was the murder weapon. It was found in that guy's back. And I agree that my client's fingerprints are on it, but that's because that's my client's knife. And the guy who actually murdered him stole the knife from my client. He was wearing gloves, so he didn't leave fingerprints, and he stabbed the guy. And all of a sudden you realize, oh yeah, that is also a possible scenario, right? So the exact same piece of evidence was interpreted in two different ways. And that's what we gotta understand. With science, there's always interpretation going on. You're not looking at things totally objectively. And you look at them through your paradigm. And scientists will do experiments and even observations based on their model or their paradigm. And they're not being bad in doing this. This is how science works, right? Like, could you imagine if, you know, there's some people who are like, oh, scientists approach everything with a blank slate. Everything is pure, unbiased observation. And it's like, that would be nonsense. Could you imagine every single time you encounter something new, you're like, well, that's new. Well, that's a new thing. That's a new thing. How does it relate to anything else? I don't know. I got to have a blank slate every time. No. You've got to have this body of knowledge you have, and then you find a new thing, and you try and figure out how does that fit into that body of knowledge, which is good, but it does mean you're already biased in thinking certain ways, and so you might miss stuff. And that's what happens a lot in science. And so bigger than a paradigm is what we call a worldview, right? So I have a Christian worldview. I have a biblical worldview. I think that God revealed himself through his word, right? And that means I'm going to interpret reality very differently from someone who doesn't think that way, okay? And so a worldview doesn't just determine how you think, it also determines how you see. And you guys have all experienced this before as you've interacted maybe on the internet or in person with people who believe differently than you, right? That you will watch the same event unfold on the news, or you will hear the same story, and you will conclude something very differently than somebody else. That you're saying, oh, that was a bad thing. And they're like, no, that was a good thing. And you're saying, oh, that was a good thing. And they're like, no, that was terrible. And you're like, how could we be so different? Right? Didn't we just witness the same thing? Yes, but you had a different starting place in your mind, in your heart. Okay, so that's kind of our backdrop we need to be able to move forward. So if you didn't like philosophy, I'm sorry we had to do that. Okay, but I think actually it's going to be worthwhile to see. We also have to do a little bit of science background, okay, before we get any further, and that's talking about earth science a little bit. And so we're going to talk about Earth Science 101. What are the basic things you need to get where we're going, okay? Everybody wants to talk about dating rocks. And to be clear, we're not talking about like bringing rocks flowers. We're talking about what age are the rocks, okay? How do we know how old they are? Now, so when I say that, most people immediately jump to, they talk about carbon dating, okay? So here's the deal. This is the secrets they don't explain to you. And it's not because it's secret, it's just because, I don't know, maybe it's boring. I don't know. Here it is. Okay, ready? In order to carbon date something, it must have carbon in it. Most rocks do not have carbon in them. Huge majority of rocks. In fact, carbon is not even in the top 10, maybe even 12 most common elements in the Earth's crust, okay? We have carbon in us. All living things have carbon in them. Some rocks have carbon in them, but most do not. And so you don't carbon date stuff, okay? We actually do what's called radiometric dating. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Carbon dating is one type of that. But really, to get to the basics of this, there's two ways to date rocks, okay? You can do what's called absolute dating or relative dating. Okay, so let me explain the difference. Absolute dating would be carbon dating, right, or radiometric dating, where you're getting an exact age for that rock. And we can talk about that later. What I want to focus on right now is relative dating. Okay, relative dating isn't saying exactly how old something is, it's saying this is older or younger than that. So for instance, if I asked you guys what you did this morning, if I said, tell me, what was your morning like? And you said, oh, I woke up at 7 a.m., I had breakfast at 7:30. I, read the newspaper at 8 a.m. I arrived here at 8:15, whatever it is, right? That's absolute dating. You're telling me exactly when each thing happened. Relative dating instead, I said, what did you do this morning? You said, well, I woke up, then I had breakfast, then I read the newspaper, then I came here. That's relative dating. You're telling me the order of events without specifying the ages, okay? So here's the deal. Creationists and evolutionists disagree a lot on the absolute dating question, but we agree very, very much on the relative dating thing. And I can give you an example right here, okay? And that concerns pancakes, okay? So if you think about pancakes for a moment, you got a stack of pancakes, okay? I'm guessing most of you have either made pancakes at some point or you have watched someone make pancakes. If you haven't, this will be probably the most shocking part of the presentation, okay? But I'm assuming most of you fall into that first or second category, okay? So here we go. Pancakes start, we're gonna, obviously you have ingredients. You mix the ingredients together, you make a batter. That batter is liquid. We're good so far, okay? It's in some kind of container and you pour it onto the pan. And the pan is what you're cooking it on, right? So as the batter goes onto the pan, it starts to spread out, right? And it spreads out horizontally. If it's spreading out like this, something is very wrong, right? Like maybe you're in Antarctica and it's freezing as it's coming out, okay? So the same thing is true with sedimentary rocks. Okay, when we talk about the rock layers like sandstones and shales and limestones, the ones that contain fossils, they are originally sediment. They're originally sand and mud and stuff like that. And as water moves them around, they lay out flat. They don't lay out like this or like this, okay? If you find some rock layers that are like this or like this, that is something that happened later, after they were laid down flat and then they got tilted, okay? So the next thing we need to talk about is what's called superposition. Okay, let's say you're making your pancakes, you take them off. You want to make a stack of pancakes. This is going to blow all your minds right now, but ready? If you want to make a stack of pancakes, the way you do it is you lay down a pancake, and then you put another one on top of that, and another one on top of that, another one on top of that. That's the stack, okay? You cannot make a stack by putting one in midair and then really quickly trying to insert one underneath it before it falls, okay? Does that make sense? Like, that's not how you're going to do it, okay? Same thing with the rock layers. If you see a layer of rocks, like if you go to the Grand Canyon, right, and you see this layer of rocks, these layers of rock, the one on the bottom was there first, okay? And then the one got laid on top, and it got laid on top. And in general, that's a really good rule, okay? Just like with pancakes, okay? Got another one for you. Also works with pancakes. It's called lateral continuity. So here's how it works. If you're pouring batter in the pan, okay, it starts spreading out horizontally. We already talked about that. Why does it stop spreading? Why doesn't it just keep spreading across the entire earth? Okay? There's going to be two reasons. One is there's edges to the pan, right? Okay? Can't keep spreading. The other one would be obviously the amount of batter. Like, you don't have an infinite, this isn't, you know, the widow's oil kind of thing. Like, it's going to end, okay? So, same thing with our rock layers. Rock layers can extend across continents. They'll be really, we'll talk about this later, really, really all over the place. But why do they end? Either they hit some kind of ending, right? Or they ran out of sediment. Like there just wasn't enough to keep making it. And if you're at the Grand Canyon and you stand at the Grand Canyon and you see that there is a hole in the ground, that is the canyon, right? And you look across and you say, hey, look, there's those rock layers over there. And I look at my side, I'm like, hey, there's the same rock layers over there. That's crazy that God just put those exact same layers in the same order on either side. No, you've missed it, right? They used to stretch across the canyon. It used to be just one big pancake stack. And then it came and got cut through, right? And that's why you have a canyon there. Water came and carved that out, okay? And so they used to connect. And so the canyon is what we call a cross-cutting relationship. So what you're doing is you're looking at it and you say, okay, I can see these layers, and then I can see this giant canyon that cuts through them. Well, obviously, the layers had to be there first, and then the canyon got carved, right? In the same way, if I wanted to cut my stack of pancakes, I can't take my knife and go like this and then bring the pancakes in, right? That doesn't make any sense. Like the pancakes have to be there first, and then I can cut them. It's the same idea. So these are really basic ideas, and these were actually all laid out in the 1600s, okay? But they're really, really important for us to understand what we see in nature. Because as we look around and we can see these rock layers that are horizontal, okay, we can do some basic reasoning and say, oh yeah, these were laid down first, and then that, and then that, and then that. And that's usually going to work really well for us. And we can go out here to Death Valley and we can see that there are layers that are angled. And we can say, oh yeah, those must have been tilted up. They were originally flat and they got pushed up on their side like that. And so we can do this kind of thinking as scientists, and that is going to be the same whether you believe in an ancient Earth or a young Earth. It's the same thing. And that leads us to talking about fossils, because we got to understand those too, okay? So fossils are the remains of once living creatures, and you can find them all around the world, and there is an order to the fossil record. So when you're at the bottom, you find different stuff than you do up at top. So when I go out and dig, actually later, I guess in a week, I'll be flying out to Wyoming to be involved with the dig for a little bit. And we dig in the green up here, the very tippy top of the green, and we'll find Triceratops bones, for instance. And they've pulled 40,000 fossils out of the ground, out of that location we are. And you can predict very easily what things you're going to get just by following the patterns. And you'll get Triceratops and Edmontosaurus and T-Rex. You'll even get little mammals and fish and birds and things. But you will not get a human. We've never found a human fossil there, never found a trilobite fossil there, because there is a predictable order. And sometimes things are surprising, but in general, there's a pattern there. And some people see this kind of thing and they think, ooh, no, that's evolution. That's the evolutionary ideas, right? And I've even heard some creationists and Christians tell me, oh, there's no order to the fossil record. There's no order to the rocks. It's just a big mess. But, all you have to do, you can go and visit Grand Canyon and you can see this exact thing. If you go down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you're in these rocks we call Precambrian, and the whole rest of the canyon makes up the rocks we call the Paleozoic. And if you go basically north-ish from the Grand Canyon, you will hit Zion National Park, which is in southern Utah, okay? Zion National Park has these big cliffs that you can see there. Those are of the Navajo sandstone, the cliffs there, and those are Mesozoic rocks. And if you keep going north, you'll eventually hit Bryce Canyon. And Bryce has all these funny-looking, they're called hoodoos, these like little things like that. And those are what we call Cenozoic rocks. And if you were to take a drill and drill down through Bryce Canyon, as deep as you could go, you would be arrested. But also, before you get arrested, you might learn something. And what you might learn is that underneath Bryce, you would find the same rocks that make up Zion, and underneath that, you would find those rocks that made up the Grand Canyon, because they're stacked up like a stack of pancakes or like a layered cake, okay? And so there is a real order to the rocks and the fossils that we find. And I want to briefly kind of show you what that order is like as it relates to Earth history and the fossils. So when you're at the very bottom of what we call the geologic column, you're in these Precambrian layers, and at the beginning, you don't find any fossils, and then you start finding these things called stromatolites. And they're still with us today. They look like rock mushrooms, basically. And listen, they're not very exciting, okay? I'll just be completely honest with you. You can go there and watch them, and they look the same. But what they are, they're rocks made out of bacteria. So bacteria grow on the surface, and they're sticky, and that traps little grains of mud and stuff, and then they get covered up, and then the bacteria grow on top of the mud, and over time, they make these things. And if you cut them open, it'll look like a rainbow inside, which is kind of cool. So these are at the bottom, and at the very, very tippy top of the Precambrian, you can find some creatures. And we call them the Ediacaran fauna. They're really weird things. This one's called Dickinsonia. It kind of looks like a pancake, may have lived like a pancake. It's not, once again, probably would not be an animal you go to the zoo to see kind of thing, okay? But some very strange stuff. And we find what looks like evidence that the continents were all put together. And as we move forward, we hit the Paleozoic, which is the blue here, okay? And one of the first things we find in the Paleozoic is just abundant living things, just suddenly showing up without ancestry. And this is called the Cambrian explosion, and it's just this rapid appearance of all these different kinds of creatures. And we'll talk about this more later. But things that have eyes and legs and gills and hard parts and all kinds of cool stuff. And as you keep going up the Paleozoic, you get fish fossils, and eventually you get some really fun extinct creatures like reptiles and these things called synapsids. And then you transition into Mesozoic rocks. And this is where you find your continents making Pangea, but you also have your dinosaurs and pterosaurs or flying reptiles, and you've got big marine reptiles in the ocean. And yeah, it was just a reptiles everywhere, all kinds of reptiles, okay? You might feel like you have lizards or snakes that bother you, but it could be worse is the point, okay? You could have a reptile the size of your house bothering you, okay? So, and then finally we enter the Cenozoic, the yellow up here, okay? And the Cenozoic, as you're getting into it, the continents are pretty close to their modern positions, and you can find at the very top, you start finding very recognizable animals that you feel very comfortable looking at. It's like, oh, that's a mammoth. It's just a hairy elephant, okay? It's basically the same thing. And then you find people. You actually find fossils of people at the very top. We'll talk about those later too. And that was kind of just a brief summary of what the fossil record looks like. So the question then is, how can a young earth creationist, how can someone who's reading scripture and saying, yeah, I think this is what it says is what it means, how can they make sense of the record of paleontology and geology that we see? So people have tried, okay? We go back to the 1500s, 1600s, and we encounter a guy named James Ussher. And he was not a geologist, he was a pastor, okay? And he was reading the Word of God, and he was reading historical sources, and he's like, I'm going to try and make a history of the earth. And so he went through and he added up all the time and everything, and he says, hey, the earth is, thousands of years old, which, by the way, is actually really old. I just want to point that out. Like, we call it young earth, but like, well, none of you are 1,000 years old. Like, that's still a long time, okay? But he says, actually, the creation of the earth occurred in 4004 BC on October the 23rd in the evening, okay? And I think it was like a Saturday, or no, it was a Sunday, I guess. You can't be that precise, okay? That's a little ridiculous. But what he said is, just by adding up the genealogies and stuff, he got an earth that was about 6,000 years old, okay, is the point. But that was before people were digging up, well, people were digging up fossils, but they weren't really systematically studying them, okay? We jump forward to the latest 1700s, earliest 1800s, and we encounter a French biologist named Georges Cuvier. And he was an expert anatomist, and he was looking at fossils, and he was comparing them to modern animals, and he was saying, hey, there's cool stuff here. And one of the things he found is when he was in Paris, in the Paris Basin, at the layers at the top, you'd find animals very similar to animals today. Sometimes in the wrong places on the earth, but very similar. But the deeper you went, the more and more different the creatures got. So eventually you went deep enough and it was marine creatures. And he's like, that's crazy. And so he's thinking about, okay, the earth is changing. But how long is this taking is the big question mark. So this was during Napoleon's reign in France, okay? And one of the things Napoleon did is he went down and started messing around in Egypt, okay? And they brought a team of scientists down to Egypt, and they started collecting stuff and stealing it. And they brought it back. And one of the things that they brought back was an ibis bird that was mummified. So if you don't know what an ibis is, it's kind of like a little crane or a stork kind of thing with like a beak like this. And Cuvier, expert anatomist, he takes